Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Hello and welcome to the London part of the show. I'm Jo Coburn. Joining me for the duration of the programme, Meg Hillier, Labour MP for Hackney South and Shoreditch, and Stephen Hammond, Conservative MP for Wimbledon. Welcome to both of you.
Good afternoon. I
want to start with the review of building regulations commissioned by the government after the Grenfell tragedy, in which 71 people died. Dame Judith Hackett called for a radical rethink of the safety system, but has stopped short of proposing a ban on flammable cladding. Hours after the report was published, the government announced it will be consulting on banning inflammable cladding. Why not just recommend a ban now?
Well, the government commissioned Judith Hackett to do the report. I hadn't seen the report, I haven't read it. I saw her on the telly last night. But I think James Brokenshire was right. It's obviously sensible to have that consultation. Let's do it, let's get it properly evidenced and then make the decision.
Right, it just sounds like the decision that the government might have wanted to make and were waiting for the recommendation from the review was to ban it. Why not just be brave and do it themselves?
Well, because I think the government quite rightly has said there's a proper process to follow here. James is following that process and I think that's the right thing to do.
Right. I mean, what is the reason, do you think, if you were talking to Grenfell survivors, what would you say to them is the reason for the government not banning it right now?
Well, because I think we need to be sure that it doesn't work everywhere. And so there are various issues, I think, about the quality of certain installations. And I think the government is right to do the consultation, and I think it's then right to make the decision on that basis. Right. You've taken an expert view. She didn't come up with the decision to ban. The government is clearly concerned about whether that's right and therefore undertaking the consultation.
And that's why you commission experts, so you listen to them.
Well, yes, but I do think with this case we had pretty clear evidence of what happened at Grenfell, and that's pretty stark evidence. So, and we, you know, the Labour's position is that we should be banning this, but actually I think we need to look wider than that, and this is where perhaps I find agreement with Stephen that you need to look at installation as well, because anything could be flammable if it's put in the wrong way and in the wrong place. So certain types, I think, you know, we're really clear should be banned now, but that's partly why the longer term review's got to come to its conclusion about how you install and how you accredit people who do it. So that, you know, I've got instances in my constituency where sometimes it's the installation that's wrong as much as the cladding, and I think that's really important, that who's held to account if someone puts it up badly. Right,
well, who should be held to account? Because if the system is broken, as Judith Hackett says, what needs to be done?
Well, I think that there are certain things that need to be done. We need to be very clear about what is being commissioned by principally now housing authorities as they're building and who's building. We need a proper review into what's been put in place beforehand, which has happened. And then who's to be accountable is who actually gave the job to the builders if it's been put in correctly, and if it's put in incorrectly, it's the builder who installed it.
Right, but who's going to make the judgment then when Theresa May announces £400 million to remove dangerous cladding? If we're not banning something that's combustible, and people will worry when they hear that word, who's going to decide which cladding is dangerous for removal?
Well, that's part of the consultation exercise, but it's partly also, there are clearly, as Meg has pointed out, and I'm pointing out to you, that there are some that have been badly installed, which we need to make sure taken out. There has already been a risk factor done of all the buildings of high-rise around London, and there's still more to do.
But that's exactly the thing. So we know in our constituencies which is dangerous. Yeah. That sort of cladding should just not be allowed to be installed. That's our position, and I think it's the right way. And then look wider at how other cladding is installed. The government is now
making money to ensure that is taken out and replaced. So that's the right thing to do.
Not for private residents. That's a big concern for them.
Well, yeah, and I think perhaps the government will need to think about a long-term loan to private residents to allow them to do it over a period of time in line with their mortgage.
I think, well, actually, the builders responsible should be taking responsibility for it. But that's something that I'm fighting on, so I'm sure you'll join me in that, Stephen.
Let's leave it there for the moment. Now, 20 years ago, over 1 million people voted in a referendum for a devolved London government. I remember it well. The first since Margaret Thatcher abolished the Greater London Council in 1986. The new Greater London Authority has been in place since 2000. But have those who voted in that referendum got what they were promised? Tim Oliver from the London School of Economics gives us his take. On May the 7th, up to 5 million Londoners will decide whether or not to restore citywide government to the capital.
And I think there's one way of reviving civic pride in London, to have one strong political leader.
Robert Livingston is duly elected the first Mayor of London.
As I was saying before I was so rudely interrupted 14 years ago.
Since the GLA was set up, we've had 3 mayors, over 100 London Assembly members, the Olympics, the congestion charge, bendy buses, an end to bendy buses, Boris bikes, the highs of a housing boom, and the lows of a financial crash. Mayors have also had to confront the horrors of terrorist attacks, riots that swept the capital, and the fire at Grenfell Tower.
The mayors have fought for better services in London and tried to check central government's cuts and influence. They've pushed forward on London-wide projects that the boroughs couldn't do on their own and that central government wouldn't do. But the system was designed 20 years ago. Looking forward to the next 20 years, is it the one that London needs?
There have been some big changes shaping the capital. Its population is on course to pass 10 million. That will mean there will be as many Londoners as the Scots, Welsh and Northern Irish combined. From just over 13% of the population, London generates just under a quarter of the UK's economy.
Without London, the UK would be bankrupt.
London feels different too. More ethnically and culturally diverse than much of the UK, the metropolis is accused of having more in common with New York and Hong Kong than with the rest of the country. That divide was reflected in London's vote to remain in the EU, unlike most of the UK.
That Leave vote was in part a rejection of some of the values, the more liberal and cosmopolitan values that define London. That it came as a shock to the UK's political elite was a reminder of how the London bubble warps UK politics.
Debate has raged about Scottish independence and growing English nationalism. Meanwhile, the biggest and most important change in UK politics is that its capital city has become a place apart.
London is more than a city. It's Britain's undiscovered country, hiding in plain sight.
And the mayoralty wasn't designed to govern this country. Sadiq Khan has less control than his counterparts in New York or Berlin.
The Greater London Authority needs to change to recognise that London is more than a city. It is the 5th part of the United Kingdom. That means a First Minister for London and a London Parliament.
Like Scotland and Wales, London should have tax-raising powers and keep a larger share of the taxes it generates. The 32 boroughs would be protected by a London constitution guaranteeing their powers.
The point would be a London running itself within a UK that could accommodate being a union of many different parts.
Hasn't time flown? And Tim Oliver joins us in the studio. Tim, is there any evidence that Londoners actually want something like this to happen?
Well, when you look at the polling and you dig into the data, you can see that Londoners are certainly different in their views to the rest of the UK in terms of certain values about being more liberal, being more kind of cosmopolitan, international, although there are large parts of London that are not like that, let's not forget. What the key thing is here is that there's a big difference growing between how the rest of the UK, and especially areas of England, view London, and how London kind of sits within the United Kingdom, where it increasingly feels as a very distant, alien place to a large number of Brits. And that is not going to go away anytime soon, I think.
Right, but in terms of it being felt like another country, which is what some people say about London, and you could point to the way they voted in the EU referendum firmly in favour of Remain. But what would actually happen in practical terms if they try to emulate what's happened in Scotland, for example, in terms of devolution? Well,
you'd have, as I said, as I proposed, you'd have an actual London Parliament and no longer have a London Mayor, you'd have a First Minister, an actual executive, so they'd have far more powers. And in that situation, you'd have a situation where politicians in London couldn't blame central government anymore for some of the problems in terms of housing and transport and so forth. Just like in Scotland, the SNP has had to, over the years, stop blaming London.
Have they?
They have, well, OK, to some extent. But given that they've not used all the powers that they've had devolved to them, people in Scotland have increasingly said, well, you have the powers to do this.
Right.
Why haven't you?
Yes, well, that's the point, though, isn't it? I mean, how different would it really be from having Sadiq Khan and the London Assembly with powers, tax-raising powers, that they may never use?
Well, if you look at what's happened in Scotland, you've seen some real changes in terms of the policing, the local government, the health service and social policy. And even in London, what would London look like today if the mayor had not been re-established 20 years ago? To take one clear example, the congestion charge probably would not have happened because central government hasn't succeeded in pushing it elsewhere in the UK, apart from maybe, I think it's Durham is the only other place that has some form of road pricing. So you can see that even with the limited powers, London has become a different place.
Do you accept that it's different enough to warrant the sort of changes and the sort of devolution that Tim is talking about?
I'm pretty unconvinced at this stage. I think you nailed it a few moments ago, as I don't think there's any demand from Londoners from this. I think what there is their demand is the mayor has got lots of powers. We're constantly told he is one of the most powerful politicians in the UK. The question is, isn't the mayor using those powers, and why isn't he using those powers? Where I think Tim has an interesting thought is the possibility of some ability for London to raise debt or bonds by itself to finance infrastructure projects. Yeah. And I think that would have a lot of resonance. But an extra tier of governance or a different tier of governance, I don't think that's on the cards, and I don't think Londoners would want it.
Right. Do you agree with that? I mean, in terms of the powers that Stephen was talking about, I mean, Sadiq Khan certainly does have a mandate, a big mandate, but in terms of powers, they're not as great as other mayors around the world.
No, but I do think that the mandate is pretty big thing, and actually politics is about influence as well as having your handles on the levers of power. The money-raising issue is an interesting one. I don't know that we want to have the precepts are not a very good way of raising tax, but I'm not sure that Londoners would welcome another layer of tax like we see in other cities around the world. And I think that Stephen's point, which I think we do agree on this, if London could raise its own finances, that would give huge opportunity, because you could make very good investments in terms of things like affordable housing, where the rents would pay it back. And then we could see, I mean, Sadiq's already producing 40% more housing this year than Boris did, so sometimes we get what we...
agree on that figure.
Well, no, well,
I mean,
sometimes we get what we pay for.
6,800 affordable houses.
Right,
well,
we're going to talk about housing.
14,000.
We are going to talk about housing in a moment. But what about politically, Stephen? The Conservatives are struggling in London, aren't they? And arguably that is because of the cultural and social reasons that Tim was talking about earlier. How do you move the dial, unless you could pursue a slightly different, perhaps, political line to the central Conservative Party?
Well, I do remember 6 weeks ago everybody telling me the Conservatives were going to be wiped out in London. I don't remember that being the result. It was a lot better than we expected it was going to be, and a lot of people a lot better than expected it to be. But I think the message for the Conservatives in London is to make sure that we are standing up for our constituencies and our communities, as ward councillors do, on local issues and on London-wide issues.
Right, but they don't agree with the government on Brexit, do they? I mean, you know that as a firm Remain supporting London MP. Surely you would like the freedom to be able to perhaps push that line more strongly than the government is at the moment.
I don't feel restrained in pushing the line on Brexit, I have to say.
That's true, you haven't been quite, but would it help?
I think, and actually Brexit, we will resolve Brexit over a period of time. And what we're talking about is the governance of London for the next 20 years. And I just think we have a mayor who has a lot of powers and influence, and he needs to be using those powers. I think there are some issues, as Meg and I have both said, about the ability to raise capital as a city to finance projects such as housing or indeed infrastructure. And I think that would be a much more interesting and probably command a lot more support from London.
But I think the mayor has huge executive power, and we've seen a very big difference between the way Boris Johnson's dealt with housing and Sadiq Khan.
So why does he keep blaming central government?
Well, because we still need, and my borough will tell you, you still need money from central taxpayer resources to fund properly affordable social housing. Well,
right.
Drop in the ocean. You can put money in and say it's enough, but it's not enough.
It's a huge amount of money.
But the idea, Tim, of London being able to raise its own funds or raise taxes, I mean, if they did sort of pull away from the rest of the country politically and financially, how would that leave the rest of the UK?
Well, I think the rest of the UK already recognises that London has gone off at a kind of to become something very different to the rest of the UK, which has caused real antagonism and frustration in some quarters. So we've got to find a way in which London and the rest of the UK can continue to develop in parallel, but in very different ways. If London is held back, then that's going to be bad for the rest of the UK. But unfortunately, from the rest of the UK's perspective, UK government and London are conflated. And we need to kind of try and break that link, in which case creating a fully devolved government for London would allow at least some people to say, well, that's not running London anymore. The UK government is for the UK.
Right, but would you be feeding this idea that London and perhaps part of the South East is just slightly separate above the rest of the country, the sort of arrogance that people might assume Londoners feel?
The kind of the London bubble.
Yeah.
And, well, to some extent, that exists also within London. There are large numbers of Londoners who are not necessarily comfortable with what London has become, who feel left behind. 40% of Londoners voted leave, let's not forget. So this is a tale, as somebody wrote recently, a tale of two cities.
Right. And in terms of the Scottish Conservatives, for example, I mean, Ruth Davidson does pursue a different tone when it comes to various debates, particularly on Brexit. Could you emulate something like that?
Well, I think that around the country, various groups form together. The London Conservatives have an identity, and don't forget, of course, we had a very successful mayor for 8 years under Boris Johnson.
Well, you would say that, of course, yes.
Well, and I think most people would, when you look what he delivered, and therefore the Conservatives had that identity.
Right.
Well, I mean, sorry, but every time Boris Johnson met a developer, he gave them what they wanted, which wasn't affordable housing or affordable workspace. And we saw a huge lot of opportunity missed because he wasn't a man for detail on the planning. And that is an interesting issue where I maybe have some overlap with Tim, that we have a planning committee of one. Now, you see a mayor who can use that one way, Boris Johnson, and a mayor who's trying to use it in a much more positive way, Sadiq Khan. And if there was a more executive planning process rather than one person, you could avoid those risks of the
We are going to talk about housing in just a moment. It clearly is the #1 issue. A final point, do you think this will ever happen, Tim?
I think the Treasury would probably faint at the idea of losing control of London's taxes, as with the Bank of England. But there will be increasing pressure given the way that London's changing over the next 20 years, or will change, and the way that the rest of England especially will continue to change. And those two rub up against one another and therefore creates friction that will drive forward increased calls for perhaps not a fully devolved government, but increased powers, or at least in terms of money-raising powers.
So you're not calling for complete divorce, then?
Oh, no, I'm not calling for independence for London, no. Oh, no, Lord.
Well, on that independent note, we'll let you go.
Thank you.
We should say that we asked the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, to join us, but he was unavailable. Now, separately, this week, Sadiq Khan said he was giving a major boost to a new programme to help get 10,000 new council homes underway over the next 4 years. He will use funds from the £1.67 billion he secured from government to help London's councils increase the rate of council home building in the capital.
In the 1970s, when I was being raised on a council estate, councils with government would build 20,000 council homes a year in London. In the last 7 years, we've only built 2,000 council homes. So I think all councils across London should think about bidding for this money.
Sadiq Khan there. Well, joining us here in the studio is Sian Berry, a Green member of the London Assembly, who also chairs its Housing Committee. Welcome to the programme. What should be the focus when it comes to housing? Which houses need to be built first?
The Mayor's right is to focus on council housing, and what he's doing at the moment is basically remedial work from a very, very low base on council housing. We inherited virtually no council housing being planned in London. Councils haven't been building for years. Right to Buy's depleted our council homes, and let's not forget lots of councils are doing regeneration projects that are delivering a net loss of council homes when they demolish and rebuild. So there's a lot to do, and last year the Mayor had £1.7 billion as well to give away, and actually only 6% of the homes getting those grants were councils.
Why?
Well, I asked him about this in the Assembly last summer, and he said the reason was that councils were simply not applying. They weren't ready with the schemes to bid for the grants, and that's partly what's going on in the new announcement. He's saying
but why
he'll put in expert help. They haven't been encouraged to do it. We've had the previous mayor who's been letting developers get away with doing affordable homes instead of council homes. The rate of grant was very, very low under Boris Johnson. Sadiq Khan's virtually doubled the rate of grant on a council home. So all of that does make a little bit of difference. But he's realised from last year's numbers, this very, very low base of 6%, that he needs to do more. So he's putting in expert help. He's trying to bring in more of the right to buy receipts that are very difficult for councils to use. But we shouldn't get too excited. What we're looking at is we're going to see some increase on 6% of the grants. We're not going to see all the new homes. £1.7 billion is not going into council homes.
He's not turbo boosting this, is he, Meg Hillier? And we've already discussed how important it is. When we look at the money that is at his disposal and the number of Labour councils who should be applying for this money, why is it not happening?
Well, I agree with Sian that we had a previous mayor who took his foot off the pedal on this, and you can't, if you've taken that expertise and that ability to seek land, get planning commissions out of councils, you've got to take a while to get from that starting position to where Sadiq wants to take us. And I think he's absolutely right to focus on properly affordable homes. I mean, Sian just used the word affordable. Let's not forget that under Boris Johnson, his definition of affordable was 80% of private rents, which was certainly way out of reach for many of my constituents in work as well as those who are in low pay.
And you continue to blame the previous Conservative mayor, but you're looking at the figures that Sian is talking about. He could be more ambitious. I mean, work began on 12,500 affordable properties in 2017-18, and there are something like 54,000 households who are in temporary accommodation.
Absolutely, and in my borough, it's abysmal what's happening to those families.
And that must be Sadiq Khan. He is the current
I mean,
mayor.
in fact, in Hackney, we've got a mayor who's delivering more council housing than I think is in the top 3 boroughs in the country. But it's still, he would acknowledge, not enough for the huge demand. And our temporary housing situation is the worst I've seen in over 20 years in elected office. And this is because if you cannot stop and start, you have to have a long-term programme.
Well,
we lost out on that.
And one of the key issues, Stephen, which Sian explained, are the restrictions that are still in place that are holding back councils either applying for the money or the fact that there is a cap on how much they can borrow. Should the government now say those restrictions are lifted?
Well, there are the 2 points. The one is that there's an awful lot of building that has been going on, and a lot of it is in different tenures. We need it across all the tenures in London, and I think that's key.
Right, but answer the question
about
the restrictions.
Well, I'm just about to come to that, because I think we're only talking about one section, and actually there's a lot more going on. And I think the message clearly would be that Boris delivered and Sadiq has sat on his hands.
But do you agree that that's the focus on council homes and affordable homes?
Well, I think it's I mean, I'm saying yes, but I'm saying it's on everything. We need... The Mayor's London plan talks about building 66,000 houses. Last year, he built 33,000, only 6,800 of which were affordable.
You haven't answered the question on restrictions.
And I think that there is... You know, Sian's right that more councils need to apply. I'm glad to see councils doing it across London, including Wandsworth, who have one of the more ambitious plans. But if there are restrictions, and there are some restrictions, as we know, which is the cap, then they've got to work with the Treasury to make sure we can't just have unlimited borrowing. We've got to make sure...
What about Conservatives like you lobbying the Treasury to say lift the cap, let councils build?
Well, some councils can build. They've got
some of the right... more to build.
They've got the right to build. They've got the right to buy receipts coming in, and you shouldn't underestimate that. You should not underestimate that.
We need an absolute step change. The need in London is something like 40,000 affordable homes every single year, and even the best councils are delivering ones of hundreds of council homes. We absolutely need more access to public land. It's a tragedy that the Holloway prison site's just been sold off by the Ministry for Justice to a big developer and a housing association.
The reason for that is the London Land Commission
hasn't opened. Not for local councils to build
This
land.
mayor has not delivered the London Land Commission.
And lifting the borrowing restrictions is just so obvious. It's beyond me why the Conservatives won't let London do this.
You've got 120,000 children living in temporary accommodation, and you've got land like the health land that was taken into central government, which those old hospital sites.
And we know the problems. We know the problems. So why not push for the solutions?
Well, the solution is the mayor has the powers to bring much of this land on. The London Land Commission, which is joint between the government and the London mayor, has not met since he's been in power. And actually, all of these sites he could have demanded. He's not using his powers to force outer London councils to build more on brownfield land. He has the power. Don't keep blaming the government. This is the mayor that blames the government every time, and most of it is at his own back door.
Meg Hillier?
Well, look, I mean, you talk about what he's done. He's been in office 2 years, and he's started this process, but he started one from a standing start. And I think it's all very well saying demand back the housing.
The NHS. More houses were being built under Boris.
Well, Meg, should you be lobbying
more houses, but not the affordable ones that my constituents...
Double the number of affordable houses, Meg, were built in the last 2 years
Who
of
are they
Boris.
affordable for, Stephen?
They were built in the last 2 years.
Well, those numbers are just wrong. But I mean, if he asks for the NHS land, it's just not being...
We're going to have to come back to this, because that's all we've got time for. I have to say thank you to Sian, and thank you to my 2 guests. From all of us, bye-bye.